Good evening. Tonight, we climb a mountain. Not merely a mountain of pine and stone tucked away in the wilderness of northern Idaho, but a mountain of suspicion, sovereignty, fear, and fatal consequence. A mountain where a family withdrew from a society they no longer trusted. A mountain where the federal government arrived armed with warrants, rifles, helicopters, and rules of engagement that would ignite outrage across an entire nation. A mountain where a 14-year-old boy died in the dirt beside his dog. Where a mother holding her infant daughter was shot in the doorway of her own cabin, where the word siege ceased to belong solely to the pages of history and returned once more to American soil. Tonight, we speak of Ruby Ridge, and we speak not in whispers, but in warnings. Because Ruby Ridge was not merely an isolated tragedy, it became a symbol, a fracture point, a moment that permanently altered how millions of Americans viewed federal power, law enforcement, militias, gun rights, surveillance, and the dangerous mathematics of fear between citizen and state. So let us begin where all dangerous stories begin, with distrust. In the late 1980s, a man named Randy Weaver moved with his family to a remote cabin near Naples, Idaho, in Boundary County. Born in 1948 in Iowa, Weaver was a former Green Beret veteran who had become increasingly distrustful of the federal government and modern American society. He and his wife, Vicki Weaver, embraced a deeply religious worldview rooted in apocalyptic Christianity. They believed the federal government had become corrupt, immoral, and tyrannical. The Weavers withdrew from mainstream society and settled atop a ridge in the Idaho wilderness. Ruby Ridge. There they raised their children, Sarah Weaver, Rachel Weaver, Samuel Weaver, Elisheba Weaver. The family homeschooled their children, stockpiled supplies, and prepared for what they believed was societal collapse. Now understand this carefully. Many Americans at the time viewed the Weavers as extremists. Others viewed them as survivalists. Others simply saw a family attempting to live independently beyond the reach of institutions they no longer trusted. But regardless of how one viewed them, they were watched. And in America, history has shown us repeatedly that once the state begins watching, escalation often follows. The story intensified in 1989. Randy Weaver became associated with members of the Aryan Nation's compound near Hayden Lake, Idaho, led by Richard Butler. This point matters, because many later attempts to discuss Ruby Ridge either erase this connection entirely or exaggerate it beyond reality. The truth is more complicated. Weaver attended some meetings and associated with certain individuals connected to white separatist circles, but evidence later suggested he was not a formal ideological leader within those movements. Nonetheless, federal authorities took interest. An undercover informant working with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, approached Weaver. In 1989, Weaver sold 2 modified shotguns to the informant. The barrels had allegedly been shortened below the legal federal limit. That transaction became the foundation of the case. And here, we encounter the first of many questions. Questions that have echoed for decades. Did federal agents deliberately pressure and manipulate Weaver? Did they attempt to recruit him as an informant against Aryan nations? Did his refusal intensify the government's pursuit? The historical record reveals that federal authorities did attempt to convince Weaver to become an informant. He refused. Soon afterward, he was indicted on federal firearms charges, and thus the machinery began to move. In December of 1990, Randy Weaver was charged with illegal possession and sale of unregistered firearms. He was ordered to appear in court. But confusion emerged surrounding the trial date. A probation officer mistakenly informed Weaver that his appearance date was March 20th, 1991. The actual court date was February 20th. When Weaver failed to appear, a bench warrant was issued. Now pause there. Because history is often shaped not merely by ideology, but by error, a wrong date, a misplaced document, a bureaucratic mistake, and from such tiny fractures, entire nations bleed. After failing to appear in court, Weaver became convinced the government intended to kill or imprison him unjustly. The U.S. Marshal Service began surveillance operations around Ruby Ridge. Tensions escalated throughout 1991 and into 1992. Marshals conducted reconnaissance missions on the property. Cameras observed the cabin. Agents mapped trails through the woods. The government viewed Randy Weaver as an armed fugitive. The Weavers viewed the government as an invading force. Two realities. Two fears, both feeding each other. Then came August 21st, 1992, the day blood touched the mountain. A team of 6 U.S. Marshals entered the wooded property near the Weaver cabin for reconnaissance. Among them were Marshals including William Degan. Also present on the mountain that day, 14-year-old Samuel Weaver, family friend Kevin Harris, and the family dog Striker. Accounts differ regarding exactly who fired first, and even now, decades later, debate remains. But what is undisputed is what followed. The dog was shot and killed. Samuel Weaver fired. A firefight erupted. Deputy U.S. Marshal William Degan was killed. Samuel Weaver was shot in the back and killed while running toward the cabin. He was 14 years old. 14. An American child dead on a mountainside. And at that moment, Ruby Ridge ceased being a warrant operation. It became a national crisis. The following day, August 22nd, the Federal Bureau of Investigation hostage rescue team arrived. Among them was sniper Lon Horiuchi. The FBI implemented controversial rules of engagement, rules that later became one of the most explosive aspects of the entire incident. The guidance reportedly stated that armed adult males seen outside the cabin could be shot on sight. Critics argued these rules violated constitutional standards governing deadly force. Defenders argued agents believed they faced heavily armed, dangerous suspects following the death of Marshal Degan. And here lies the eternal conflict of state power. Security versus liberty. Force versus restraint. Fear versus law. On August 22nd, Randy Weaver, Kevin Harris, and 16-year-old Sarah Weaver approached the cabin after visiting Samuel's body. FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi fired. The first shot wounded Randy Weaver. The second shot struck Kevin Harris, but the bullet continued into the cabin doorway. There stood Vicki Weaver, holding her 10-month-old daughter, Elisheba. The bullet struck Vicki Weaver in the head. She died instantly. Her infant survived. And with that shot, Ruby Ridge entered American memory forever. A mother killed while holding her child. A scene so shocking that even many defenders of federal law enforcement recoiled in horror. The siege continued for 11 days. Negotiators attempted communication. The nation watched. Media coverage exploded. Eventually, civilian negotiator Bo Gritz helped persuade Randy Weaver to surrender peacefully. On August 31st, 1992, the standoff ended. Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris were taken into custody. Then came the trials, and the trials transformed public perception even further. In 1993, Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris stood trial in federal court. The results stunned many Americans. Weaver was acquitted of murder, conspiracy, and assault charges. Kevin Harris was acquitted on grounds of self-defense regarding the death of Marshal Degan. Weaver was convicted only of failing to appear in court and violating bail conditions. He was sentenced to 18 months, though he had already served significant time. To millions watching, the verdicts raised devastating questions. If the government had justified the siege under the premise of dangerous, murderous extremists, why had the central charges collapsed? Why had a mother died? Why had a child died? Why had rules of engagement appeared to contradict constitutional protections? Investigations followed. The U.S. Senate held hearings. The Department of Justice reviewed FBI conduct. The rules of engagement were heavily criticized. Federal officials acknowledged serious failures. In 1995, the federal government agreed to a civil settlement with the Weaver family. Approximately $3,100,000 was awarded. Kevin Harris later received a separate settlement. No amount of money resurrects the dead, but settlements often reveal something important. Governments rarely pay millions simply because everything went perfectly. And yet, Ruby Ridge did not end at Ruby Ridge. Its echoes spread. Militia movements cited it as proof of federal overreach. Gun rights activists invoked it as a warning. Anti-government groups treated it as evidence that the state would use lethal force against citizens. Then, less than a year later, came another catastrophic siege, Waco siege. And after Waco came rage. After rage came radicalization. And on April 19, 1995, Timothy McVeigh carried out the Oklahoma City bombing, killing 168 people. McVeigh cited Ruby Ridge and Waco as motivations. Understand what this means. One tragedy became fuel for another. State violence fueled paranoia. Paranoia fueled extremism. Extremism fueled terror, and terror fueled even greater expansion of state power. The cycle fed itself, as it so often does. Now some will say Ruby Ridge proves all government is tyranny. Others will say it proves extremist ideology inevitably breeds violence. But perhaps the deeper lesson is more uncomfortable than either slogan. Perhaps Ruby Ridge reveals what happens when fear consumes both sides simultaneously. A government convinced every dissenter may become a domestic threat. Citizens convinced every federal agent is an occupying force, each side viewing the other not as human beings, but as enemies. And once that transformation occurs, the distance between warrant and warfare becomes terrifyingly small. History is littered with moments where governments overreact in the name of security. The Palmer raids, the Japanese-American internment, McCarthyism, COINTELPRO, Kent State, and yes, Ruby Ridge. Different eras, different enemies, different excuses, but the same ancient temptation to sacrifice restraint in the name of order. But beware as well the opposite seduction. The temptation to romanticize every armed standoff against authority as righteous rebellion. For blind distrust can be just as dangerous as blind obedience. A nation cannot survive if every institution is automatically worshipped, nor can it survive if every institution is automatically viewed as demonic. The answer lies not in worship, nor hatred, but scrutiny. Relentless scrutiny. The citizen must question power, and power must fear the question. That is liberty. Ruby Ridge remains one of the most controversial law enforcement incidents in modern American history. To some, Randy Weaver became a martyr. To others, a dangerous extremist elevated beyond reason. To some, federal agents were protectors facing lethal threats. To others, symbols of unconstitutional force unleashed without restraint. History, as always, refuses simplicity. But the dead remain. Samuel Weaver, Vicki Weaver, William Degan, 3 graves upon the altar of escalation. 3 reminders that once fear takes command, tragedy is rarely far behind. So tonight, as cameras glow and commentators scream and governments once again expand powers in the name of safety, remember Ruby Ridge. Remember how quickly suspicion became siege. Remember how rapidly bureaucratic machinery escalated into bloodshed. Remember that liberty is not preserved by silence, nor by violence, but by vigilance. And perhaps most importantly, remember that a government should fear becoming so powerful that its citizens see it as an army. And citizens should fear becoming so consumed by distrust that every knock at the door sounds like war. Because nations do not collapse only from invasion. Sometimes they collapse from the widening canyon between ruler and ruled. And once that canyon becomes hatred, the mountain burns. Good evening.